Has anybody ever told a lie about you? Has anybody ever slandered you in that way? Have you ever suffered loss? Have you ever been put in an awkward situation because somebody had lied about you? I gotta admit that's happened to me a couple of times. It's been really difficult to deal with, especially if the person who is lying about you is a person of position or authority. But Paul tells us in his epistles that we should live a life that is so transparently good, that is so wonderful in relationship to God, that we should live as in our society. We should be the best citizen we can be, so that if somebody was to lie about you and say that you did some horrible, nasty thing, even the community at large, even the people who aren't Christians, would say, nah, that doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like the person that I know. So we should live above reproach, is what Paul had said. So when Paul is writing his letters, and he's giving us this advice and saying we should live above reproach, so that even the accusers would not really be able to accuse you well, that people would not believe the accusers when they heard people accusing you of doing something wrong. I think he has several instances in his life where that's been the case, where somebody lied against him. Today we're going to study one of those. And we're in Acts chapter 21. If you remember our last lesson, there were rumors about Paul after he had finished his missionary journey and he came to Jerusalem. The pastors of the church of Jerusalem said, hey, there's a bunch of rumors about you, and I need you to do these extra things for rumor control. And so Paul was in the midst of doing those things, which was to purify himself in the temple and to offer to pay the purification tax for these guys who were under a vow. So we studied with that last week. If you want to, you can review the lesson from last week to see what all that's about. But here we are in chapter 21 of Acts. We're going to start reading at verse 27. Okay, so here it comes. Verse 27, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and against this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul and dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. He at once took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them, and when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. Then the tribune came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. He inquired who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd were saying one thing, were shouting one thing, and some in the crowd were shouting another thing. And he, the tribune, could not learn the facts because of the uproar, so he ordered him to be brought into the soldiers' barracks. And when he came to the steps, he was actually carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the crowd. For the mob of the people followed, crying out, Away with him! And as Paul was about to be brought into the barracks, he said to the tribune, May I say something to you? And he said, Do you know Greek? Aren't you the Egyptian then who recently stirred up a revolt and led the 4,000 men of the assassins out into the wilderness? And Paul replied, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people. And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, "Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you." And when they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, Jerusalem, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are on this day." And he continues to give his testimony of what happened to him, how he used to be a Jew who was against Christianity, how he met Jesus on the road to Damascus, how he then started preaching about Jesus. And let's just review, let's go back to the very first part of this and see the lie, okay? Verse 27, when the 7 days of the purification rites in the temple were almost complete, the Jews from Asia saw him in the temple and lied about him. Where was the Jews from Asia? What's that all about? Well, those are the same guys who on Paul's missionary journey tried to kill him. They were so angry that he came into the synagogues and was teaching the Jewish people that Jesus is the Messiah. They were so angry about that they actually tried to kill him. And he twice, maybe even 3 times, had escaped from them. In one case being lowered over the wall in a basket. In another case just kind of disappearing in the middle of the night. They had a plot to kill him. They wanted him dead. And they couldn't do it when he was on his missionary journey, but now here he is in Jerusalem. These same Jewish leaders who refused to accept Jesus as their Messiah when Paul was in their town, now they're in Jerusalem, where they've got a whole bunch of people with them. And they see Paul, and they just immediately flip their lid. Like it just goes crazy. Because they saw him earlier that day, not in the temple, but they saw him in Jerusalem earlier, the earlier day, like yesterday. And they saw him with this guy from Ephesus, who they know is not a Jewish man, he's a Gentile. They saw him with Trophimus. So they lied about him. They said, I bet he even brought that Trophimus, the Gentile, into the temple. Like not even just the Gentile court, into the actual temple itself, which didn't actually happen. So they lied about him. They said he's teaching everybody against the law of Moses, against the temple, which isn't true. But they were just angry about him. And they said he also brought Greeks. He brought Gentiles into the temple, which he did not do. And so for that reason, they laid hands on him, and then they were beating him. Did you notice that? They were beating him. So somebody goes and gets the Roman soldiers. They're the ones in charge of keeping the peace here in Jerusalem. It's part of the Roman Empire now, after all. And we've given the Jews, these people have their own strange customs, and they've got this big building that they think is really important, the temple. So we let the Jewish people in Jerusalem do their own thing to some degree. We just insist on law and order. So here comes the Jewish people and some of the people from Jerusalem saying, hey, there's a big fight happening out of the temple. You might want to take care of that. So they had taken Paul out of the temple, and they were beating him. And so it says at the end of verse 32, and when they saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. They were already beating him because of the lie. And so the tribune says, what's going on? Who is this guy? And half the crowd says one thing, half the crowd says another. He decides, I can't really find the truth unless I question him myself. So they bring him into the soldiers' barracks. And on the way into the barracks, he says, can I ask you a question? And they're actually kind of shocked that he can speak Greek. He was speaking Greek to the Roman soldiers. And so he says, I thought you were the Egyptian guy who was in charge of the sect of the assassins and had helped those assassins escape into the wilderness. And Paul said, no, I don't know what you're talking about, bud. That ain't me. And he says who he is and asks if he can speak to the people. In other words, Paul is saying, I think I can help you with your law and order problem. Let me just talk to him. Let me explain that somebody lied about me, that there's really no reason to be upset because I've done nothing wrong, because I have lived above reproach. So he gives them his testimony, and it says in verse 2 of chapter 22, when the people in Jerusalem heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet, and they listened to him. They stopped trying to kill him, trying to rip him limb for limb, and they were listening. And he gave his whole testimony here. Testimony about Damascus, about Ananias. And then he went to the temple. This is after his conversion. He came to Jerusalem, came to the temple, and now he says this. I need to read this to you. Acts chapter 22, verse 17. When I returned to Jerusalem and I was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance, and I saw Jesus in this trance saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I have imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and holding their coats of the people who were killing him. And he said to me, Jesus said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. That's as much as they were willing to hear. Verse 22. Up to this word they listened to him, and then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And as they were shouting and throwing off their coats and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging to find out why they were shouting against him like this. That now the centurion, he says, I'm not going to get to the bottom of this unless I actually torture the man. I've got to ask him who he is and then beat him with rods or flog him with my whip and then ask him again until I get the truth out of him. Why do these people hate you? Why do they want to kill you? Like, you must have done something really bad. So I'm going to inquire of him through torture what it is that he's done. He'll eventually tell me. It might take a few rounds of torture, but he'll tell me. I'll beat him and ask him, beat him and question him, flog him and question him, whip him and question him. Look what happens. Verse 25. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, they took off his clothes, they put chains on his hands, they stretched out his hands, they put him up against the pole, they were getting ready to whip him on his back. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and who has not been condemned of a crime? Or is it really lawful for you to just flog somebody who's only been accused of something if that person is a Roman citizen? And the tribune came to him and said to him, tell me then, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes, I am, which was true. Paul was a Roman citizen. His dad was a Roman soldier. Verse 28, the tribune answered, I bought this citizenship for a large sum. I know you can buy a citizenship. That doesn't really matter. Paul said, but I am a citizen by birth. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. They dropped their whips. And the tribune was also afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him and tied him up to this torture machine. They were getting ready to torture him. And he was really worried about that. But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet. And he brought Paul down and set him before them. And we're going to have to stop there today. So Paul gave a big testimony. It goes from chapter 22, verse 3, and it goes all the way to verse 21. And it's just the beginning of the testimony. He didn't even get into the whole missionary journeys. It's just his conversion story. It's great. I skipped all that today in this devotion. I encourage you to read it because there's nothing really new that we learn here. It's stuff that we've already read, but it's retold here as part of the story because Paul is telling it now to a bunch of Jewish people who were mad at him because of a lie. Mad at him because he brought Gentiles into the temple, which was not allowed, but he didn't do that. Mad at him because he had destroyed the faith of a bunch of Jewish people by telling them that they shouldn't be Jewish anymore and they should revile the temple, which he never did. So again, Paul is in trouble for something he hasn't done. He's being lied about. Because if you have somebody who knows the truth, then oftentimes that truth is it's an obstacle to powerful people. And so those powerful people will oftentimes lie about you in order to silence the truth so that they can continue living their lie. It's a difficult thing to deal with someone who's lied about you. I unfortunately have experience with this. In one case, it was a pastor, not where I am now, but in a different place. It was a pastor who I was working with. I was on the ministry team, and that pastor lied about me to the people. I just had to leave. I couldn't stay there any longer. And I didn't, you know what, I never actually told the people that what the pastor had said about me was a lie. It wouldn't have done any good for me to rail against such authority. So I just think this is an interesting passage of the book of Acts. It's a passage of Paul's life story. It had to happen. It's part of God's plan for Paul's life, just like me being lied about in this church in a different state was part of God's plan for my life as well. Not what I wanted, not what I would have envisioned, not what Paul wanted to hear, I'm sure. But God is working out his master plan in Paul's life, just like God was working out a plan in my life. I wouldn't be where I am today. I wouldn't have the ministry that I have today if God had not allowed this lie to happen. And it's just that we have to trust God. Trust God and stay on task with him, stay in line with the Holy Spirit, stay on the course that he set for you, and God will work it all out. It's going to work out for Paul, too, because if you remember, Paul has been telling people he wants to go to Jerusalem, where he's going to be arrested, and he wants to go to Rome. So it's part of God's plan for how Paul is going to get to Rome, that he has to first be arrested for a lie. Because there's no real reason to arrest him. He hasn't done anything wrong. Paul has not done anything wrong. And so he's going to be arrested for this lie. And that's what's important. Who told the lie? It's the men who were in charge of the Jewish synagogues in the cities that he had been on in his missionary journey, where he had told people about Jesus and started a Christian church. Some of the people from his Christian church used to belong to the Jewish synagogue, including in one case, the very leader of that synagogue, who became a Christian and who was part of Paul's church that he started. So because you've done something great for God, sometimes it wrinkles some people's, ruffles some people's feathers. It makes them upset. It rubs them the wrong way. Because you are a threat to them? I don't know. Maybe it's because really the gospel and the truth of who God is a threat to them. Just trust in God. If you've been lied to, sometimes it's not worth it to kick up a storm and to go to social media and say, this is a lie, right? Like we see some powerful people in our country doing that almost on a daily basis, making themselves look like even more of a fool by defending themselves in the public eye. Paul defends himself, but only to the Roman soldiers. And when I was accused, I didn't defend myself in public because that would not have been beneficial to me. And so you have to have some wisdom. You have to have wisdom in dealing with somebody who has lied about you. Your reaction might say more about you than what the lie is that somebody said that you were guilty of. Something that they told you, everybody you did, and you didn't really do. How you handle the lie and how you handle the liar can sometimes reveal more about your character and can paint you to be, honestly, the truth of who you are. People are supposed to live, Christians are supposed to live above reproach. We should live in such a way that even if somebody accuses us of having done something wrong, the people would be like, that doesn't sound like the guy I know. I don't believe you. And so that's what I have here for us from today's lesson. Really, it's just a step in a process. We'll see next week why this was important and why this lie had to happen and why he had to be arrested for having done nothing wrong. It's part of God's plan. Just trust in God, and sometimes let people lie about you and don't even correct them. It's not worth it sometimes. There are times when you do have to stand up and defend yourself against these lies, but sometimes doing so would play right into their hands. And so it's best to just ignore it and move on. Paul is being arrested because of this lie, but it's part of God's plan. So tune in next week to see how this story unfolds.